Consider again Paul's words in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. All Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. Paul insisted that all Scripture, regardless of literary genre, equips Christians to please God. Moreover, since every passage of Scripture is relevant to ethics, it is legitimate to focus on the moral aspects of any given passage, even if the biblical author did not emphasize the moral aspect himself. In short, if we ignore the ethical implications of any portion of Scripture, we cut ourselves off from the full scope of ethical guidance offered in God's revelation. Now, the fact that Scripture uses so many types of language and literature to teach us about ethics has some interesting implications for the way we teach ethics today. For one thing, Scripture's variety implies that our own teaching of ethics might benefit from using different genres. It is true that direct ethical instruction helps us understand many things, but something is also lost when we rely entirely on straightforward instruction. Simple statements often do not touch our emotions in the same way that poetry and narratives do, just as the plain ethical instructions in Scripture are rarely as moving or memorable to us as the Psalms or the stories about Jesus. The situations explored in typical ethics lectures are seldom as subtle as those in narratives, and simple statements rarely move us to ponder moral issues the way Proverbs do. So, at times it may be helpful to teach and preach ethics in the various forms of language used by Scripture itself. In some settings, our teachings on ethical decision-making will be more effective if we use our own poetic imagery, stories, proverbs, parables, and other genres that are not usually associated with ethics. So, as we think specifically about Christian ethics, we need to remember that all the varieties of language and literature in Scripture are normative, and we also need to pay special attention to the different ways in which each type of language and literature communicates ethical instruction. Only by handling each type appropriately can we properly understand its ethical teachings. Now that we have introduced how the different forms of language and literature in the Bible guide us in our use of Scripture as our moral standard, we should turn our attention to God's law in Scripture, to those portions of the Bible that address ethics most explicitly. In Christian and Jewish traditions, the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are known collectively as the law. But when we speak of God's law in these lessons, we will not be referring primarily to the books of Moses, but to those portions of Scripture that are written in the literary form of a legal code. Those portions are found primarily in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but those books also contain historical narrative, poetry, lists, and other portions that are not part of their legal code. Moreover, some portions of the legal code are found outside the books of Moses. Now, as we have said, God's law is not the only part of Scripture that contains normative ethical instruction. All Scripture is normative, but the law contains the clearest and most explicit expressions of many of God's ethical requirements and has traditionally served well as a starting place for ethical investigation. Our look into God's law will divide into 2 sections. First, we will explain the importance of the 10 Commandments, which are the foundational commandments in God's law. And second, we will introduce the three different types of God's law that theologians have traditionally recognized. Let's begin by turning our attention to the Ten Commandments.